Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we take the sources you share with us, filter out the noise, and deliver the essential, mind-expanding knowledge you need.
Today we are plumbing the depths of a writer so prolific, so witty, and so utterly contradictory.
He really didn't just define the role of the public intellectual. He practically invented it for the entire modern age.
We are deep diving into the life and influence of George Bernard Shaw.
And we should probably honor his preference right from the start.
We must. Though he was christened George, he insisted on being known simply as Bernard Shaw.
Bernard Shaw, a fascinating figure whose writing career stretched from the Victorian era all the way into the 1950s.
And a man who uniquely left his mark on both the West End stage and, the political manifesto.
It's just astonishing when you think about that trajectory. This is a person who produced well over 60 plays, revolutionized English drama with this radical dose of realism.
And he achieved that ridiculously rare double feat.
The one that connects high literature and Hollywood spectacle.
Winning both the Nobel Prize in Literature and an Academy Award. I mean, who does that?
Exactly.
Indeed. Shaw was so much more than an Irish playwright and critic. He was a relentless polemicist, a political activist.
His influence really shaped Western theater, culture, and especially progressive thought.
Oh, absolutely. Starting in the 1880s and continuing long, long after his death, when we study Shaw, you're forced to confront this dual nature of his work.
The dazzling, unforgettable entertainment on one hand.
And then the fierce, uncompromising political sermonizing he wrapped around it.
So our mission today for you, the learner, is to synthesize this complex, contradictory identity.
We've pulled together a stack of detailed biographical and scholarly sources to really try and understand the man.
The man who made even dense, difficult topics not just palatable, but captivatingly entertaining.
We'll move from the challenging circumstances of his Dublin birth and the political transformation he engineered for himself
into the groundbreaking realism of his plays.
And then, look, we have to tackle the truly provocative and often deeply uncomfortable social beliefs he championed.
Right down to alphabet reform and his controversial support for dictators.
It is the journey of a self-taught outsider who became the voice of his age.
We really need to look closely at the nuggets in the sources.
For instance, we have to get our heads around why a man who wrote these passionate socialist tracts also championed the forced evolution of humanity through eugenics.
It's a huge contradiction.
We're going to trace how his desire to fix the world led him down some fascinating yet deeply troubling paths.
Okay, let's unpack this epic journey. Let's start at the beginning. So the early years of Bernard Shaw, they were anything but privileged, right? Despite his family's background.
Well, that's the key tension right there. He was born in 1856 in Portobello, Dublin, into what the sources describe as shabby genteel poverty.
That phrase is so important.
It is. It means they had the family name, the inherited status, the airs and expectations of the gentry.
But none of the money.
Absolutely none of the money to back it up. His father, George Carr Shaw, was, he was an ineffectual alcoholic, working irregularly after being pensioned off from a minor civil service role.
So you have this constant strain between aspiration and reality defining his entire youth.
And what was the domestic atmosphere like?
Emotionally difficult is the short answer. His mother, Bessie Shaw, she married partly to escape a tyrannical great-aunt, but she came to deeply resent her husband.
And his drinking.
Young Shaw, he didn't endure physical harshness, but he later said he was profoundly scarred by her indifference, her lack of affection.
He called his home life not cruel, but
emotionally desolate.
So if his home was cold and his education was, by his own account, a disaster.
He hated it. Hated the 4 schools he attended, called them prisons and turnkeys.
So where did he find the resources to become Bernard Shaw?
He found it in music and literature.
Right. His mother, Bessie, she became very close to George John Lee, a charismatic music teacher.
And the sources note their house was just constantly filled with music. It was a solace for the young Shaw.
And it was through Lee and the access he got to Lee's students who lent him books that Shaw acquired this thorough knowledge of music and literature.
It basically compensated for that disastrous formal schooling. He rejected the structure, but he clearly loved learning.
He did. He quit school at 15 to work as a junior clerk, rising quickly to head cashier in a Dublin land firm.
Before resigning in 1876.
And that resignation was the real turning point. At 20, he leaves Ireland for good, for London,
following his mother and sister who had already moved there.
Right. And he refused to take up clerical work again. Instead, remarkably, he was subsidized by his mother for 4 years while he just dedicated himself to writing.
This was his university.
This was his true university phase, yes.
This whole self-education project in London is legendary. It's where the critical intellectual Shaw was really forged.
It certainly was. He secured a reader's pass for the British Museum reading room. That was his workshop.
He spent most weekdays there, just reading and writing.
Embarking on what biographers call a rigorous process of self-education, he didn't just read. He systematically devoured philosophy, political economy.
Building his own intellectual framework from scratch.
But the writing, it didn't immediately yield results.
Yeah.
The sources mentioned these early literary failures.
Oh, yes. His first attempts at drama were abandoned. He wrote 5 novels in this early period.
All rejected.
All of them. His first completed novel, Immaturity.
From 1879, right?
Yeah, that one. It was considered too grim by publishers. It wasn't actually published until the 1930s.
When he was famous enough that, anything he wrote was marketable.
And we see the origins of his famous persona during this lean time, too.
Absolutely. He adopts this strict lifestyle, becomes a principled vegetarian in 1881.
Initially for economy, but then he maintained it for life.
Right. And he grew his famous beard to hide facial scars from a smallpox attack.
These pragmatic choices that quickly became iconic parts of his whole persona.
The eccentric intellectual.
So we have the self-taught, struggling vegetarian writer living off his mother. What was the catalyst? What turned him from an obscure novelist into a passionate, radical political activist?
That turning point came in 1882. He went to a lecture by the political economist Henry George.
And it just gripped him.
Utterly gripped him. It sparked his interest in economic justice, which led him to read Karl Marx's Das Kapital in 1883. He came out of that phase deeply committed to socialism.
But he didn't stick with the revolutionary Marxists of the time. He gravitated toward a more intellectual circle.
That would be the Fabian Society. He joined in 1884, and he very quickly became its most persuasive and public voice.
Its most prominent pamphleteer.
Exactly. His first public contribution was the Society's first official manifesto, Fabian Tract No. 2.
And that's where he declared that the system resulted in the division of society into hostile classes, with large appetites and no dinners at one extreme, and large dinners and no appetites at the other.
It's a powerful summary, isn't it?
So how did that early socialist zeal get translated into the core Fabian philosophy?
Well, Shaw was instrumental in charting the course toward pragmatism. He went to meetings of the British Economic Association, which he ironically called his closest approach to a university education.
Right.
And he moved away from Marxism's call for immediate, violent revolution. He became the chief apostle of gradualism.
The belief that socialism should be achieved not through upheaval, but through cautious, incremental change.
Through legislation. And this gradual approach relied on a specific mechanism.
Permeation.
Permeation, the Fabian strategy of infiltrating existing political parties, institutions, the civil service, with socialist ideas.
The goal was to subtly steer society leftward, convincing the ruling classes of the rational need for reform, one law at a time.
It was a strategy based on intellect and persuasion, perfectly suited to Shaw's style.
And this was all cemented in the influential Fabian Essays in Socialism in 1889, which he edited. He was becoming a serious political force.
And he eventually put these principles into practice himself.
He did, though he often found municipal politics a bit tedious compared to writing tracts.
I can imagine. In 1897, he served as an uncontested vestryman for St. Pancras. The sources say he took his duties very seriously. Health, public lighting.
Proving he was willing to put his gradualist philosophy into action on the local level.
He served until the Metropolitan Borough of St. Pancras was formed in 1899.
And before we shift to the theater, a quick note on his personal life. After a major health breakdown from overwork, he marries Charlotte Payne Townsend in 1898.
Charlotte, a wealthy Anglo-Irish woman in the Fabian circle. The sources suggest the marriage was entirely felicitous in terms of compatibility.
But it's widely believed to have been unconsummated.
A source of endless speculation. Crucially, her wealth gave Shaw the financial freedom he needed to write without commercial pressure.
And in 1906, they established their country home, Shaw's Corner, where he lived for the rest of his life. That stability was vital.
It was everything for his dramatic output.
Okay, so the political ideals were settled, the critical mind was honed, and the financial foundation was set. Did this stability finally free him to start building the new English theater he'd dreamed of?
Absolutely. The transition from critic to playwright was a conscious campaign. It was a political act as much as an artistic one.
And he was profoundly influenced by the Norwegian playwright
Henrik Ibsen. He dedicated himself to introducing a powerful new realism into English language drama, fundamentally disrupting the stale conventions of the Victorian stage.
He saw the stage not as just a place for entertainment, but as a kind of legislative chamber.
Exactly. His plays were explicitly designed to be vehicles for his ideas: political, social, philosophical. He wanted to challenge bourgeois morality.
And he used his critical platform brilliantly to prepare the way, from 1895 to 1898, as the theater critic for the Saturday Review.
Writing as GBS.
And he did not mince words. He demanded theater of real ideas and true characters.
He was a revolutionary critic. He campaigned relentlessly against melodrama, against hypocrisy. He basically laid out the blueprint for the very dramas he was about to write himself.
Saying he had to manufacture the evidence to support his case.
He needed plays that actually discussed things that mattered, and since they didn't exist,
he had to write them.
And that manufacturing process started with his notoriously provocative Plays Unpleasant.
Why that title?
Because they address subjects that the comfortable, middle-class audience did not want to confront. Widowers' houses.
Slum landlords.
And the complicity of the respectable class in poverty. The Philanderer was a satire on new sexual ethics.
And then there was the most challenging one, Mrs. Warren's Profession.
This play, written in 1893, was a searing indictment of the entire social structure. I mean, it exposed Mrs. Warren's literal profession, a prostitute and brothel owner.
But Shaw made it clear her trade was just a symptom.
It was a metaphor for a wider prostituted society, where all successful enterprises, whether it's banking or brothel keeping, were based on economic exploitation.
The public reaction was
outrage. Complete outrage. It was deemed so immoral it was banned from public performance in London until 1925.
That ban was crucial, wasn't it? It cemented his reputation as this dangerous radical.
And it proved his point. The theater establishment preferred sentimental lies over uncomfortable truths.
After that shock, he released The Plays Pleasant, which finally brought him success.
Yes. Arms and the Man in 1894 was a breakthrough. It's a delightful mock Ruritanian comedy that satirizes love, military honor, class.
He subverted the idea of the heroic soldier,
introducing characters who are pragmatically interested in food and comfort, not death and glory.
The press initially hated it, didn't they? Accused him of sneering at heroism and patriotism.
But the audience loved its wit and cynicism. The financial success was significant. It earned him enough to finally resign his last salaried job.
It proved you could write intellectually challenging plays that were also hugely entertaining.
He followed this up with 3 plays for Puritans, focusing on empire and imperialism.
Right, The Devil's Disciple and Caesar and Cleopatra. He's using historical allegory to talk about contemporary power.
Showing that empire, whether it's Roman or British, often rests on questionable moral foundations.
And moving into the 20th century, we hit the royal court era, where his dominance was really established.
A golden age for Shaw. Between 1904 and 1909, the management team of Vedran and Granville Barker staged an incredible 14 of his plays in just 5 years.
And one of the biggest talking points of that era was John Bull's Other Island,
a comedy about an Englishman in Ireland that became a phenomenon. It's famous for the story that King Edward VII saw it and laughed so hard he broke his chair.
But the content itself was radical. It was a candid, non-romanticized assessment of Irish nationalism.
Which is precisely why Yeats in the Abbey Theatre declined to stage it in Dublin. They were afraid it would cause affront.
Because Shaw refused to treat Ireland with sentimental reverence.
His commitment was always to truth and political efficacy, which often superseded national sentiment.
This period also gave us one of his most philosophical works, Man and Superman.
A major text. It was a huge commercial success, but it was also the primary vehicle for his philosophical system, which he called creative evolution.
And the play blended dramatic text with a long, printed philosophical section.
The Revolutionist's Handbook. It was a complex statement on purpose and procreation.
Let's just clarify creative evolution here, because it's essential for his later, more controversial politics.
Right. So creative evolution was Shaw's attempt to provide a kind of quasi-religious engine for his socialism. It went beyond simple Darwinian natural selection.
He believed humanity had to consciously strive toward its own betterment.
Driven by a non-supernatural life force. It suggested humans should consciously manage their own destiny, which, as we'll see, dangerously morphed into support for eugenics.
And the thematic diversity just continued with plays like Major Barbara.
a brilliant exploration of morality, money, and war. Major Barbara contrasted a Salvation Army major with her estranged, cynical father.
Who's a massively successful arms manufacturer.
And Shaw doesn't just contrast them. He forces the audience to realize that the good, moral action of the Salvation Army requires funding, and that money, regardless of its source, holds the ultimate power.
Classic Shavian paradox.
And then came the plays that cemented his international immortality. Pygmalion and St. Joan.
Pygmalion, 1912. A masterful study of language, class, and social mobility.
It's a comedy, but it deeply explores how your place in society is determined not just by birth, but by the language you use. It was a phenomenon.
But he had a constant battle with the actors and producers who wanted to impose a romantic happy ending.
And that detail, that fight against the happy ending, tells you everything about his dedication to ideas over sentiment.
He was so determined to prevent the romance between Eliza Doolittle and Professor Higgins
That he had to revise the ending, explicitly writing a postscript to clarify that Eliza marries a minor character, Freddie. He felt the play was ruined if the audience thought love triumphed over intellectual independence.
And then St. Joan in 1923, perhaps his greatest artistic triumph.
Written shortly after Joan of Arc's canonization, the play received enthusiastic acclaim everywhere. He treated Joan as a no-nonsense mystic, Protestant, and nationalist before her time.
Stripping away the sentimental religious veneer.
To focus on her revolutionary individuality and her conflict with the established church and state.
And these two plays, along with his entire output, led to that incredible recognition we mentioned at the top.
He achieved something unprecedented. First, he was awarded the 1925 Nobel Prize in Literature.
And true to form, he accepted the distinction but rejected the prize money.
Said it was a life belt thrown to a swimmer who has already reached the shore. He used the funds to sponsor the Anglo-Swedish Literary Foundation.
Took the prestige, redirected the cash, and then came the ultimate collision with the lowbrow world of entertainment.
Exactly. He later provided the screenplay for the 1938 film of Pygmalion and subsequently received an Academy Award for Best Written Screenplay.
Which made him the first person ever to win both a Nobel Prize and an Oscar.
And, entirely predictably, he called the Oscar an insult, adding it was like giving a statue to the King of England for being king.
Yeah.
Yet the sources confirm he did keep the golden figurine on his mantelpiece.
Okay. Winning the Oscar and the Nobel proves he mastered the stage. But long before that, he was using a different weapon. The critic's pen.
GBS, the unapologetic witty opinion machine.
Let's start with music.
Shaw's criticism was always brilliant, opinionated, and exceptionally written. As a music critic, he first wrote as Coro di Bassetto for the Star.
A name he chose because he thought it sounded dashing, despite disliking the instrument.
Right. He later wrote as GBS for the World.
So what were his main campaigns in the world of classical music?
He was a fierce polemicist. His biggest campaign was promoting the music of Richard Wagner, whom he saw as a revolutionary.
And conversely, he waged war on the conservative establishment of Brahmsian composers in England.
He saw them as creatively stagnant. He also attacked performance conventions, insisting on smaller professional choruses over huge amateur choirs in Handel, and campaigning against opera being sung in languages unknown to the audience.
He demanded clarity and integrity.
Always. And he brought that same relentless drive into his drama criticism. He championed Ibsen. He praised Oscar Wilde, whom he called our only thorough playwright.
Appreciating Wilde's witty play with the established form.
And then there's Shakespeare. His relationship with the bard was famously and deliberately complicated.
He insisted on spelling his name Shakespeare.
And he famously claimed, with the single exception of Homer, there is no eminent writer whom I can despise so entirely as I despise Shakespeare when I measure my mind against his.
That quote is often taken as evidence he hated Shakespeare, but that wasn't the whole story, was it?
Not at all. He immediately followed that up by saying, but I am bound to add that I pity the man who cannot enjoy Shakespeare.
So his main targets were not the plays themselves.
No, it was the bardolaters, the uncritical worshippers of Shakespeare, and crucially the actors and directors who, in his view, butchered the texts with insensitive cuts and sentimental productions.
For Shaw, theater was a living, practical enterprise, not a holy text.
Exactly. He even wrote 3 plays incorporating Shakespearean themes, so he couldn't actually leave the subject alone.
This inherent drive to provoke, to challenge, it defined his political activity, especially when the world collapsed into war. Let's start with WWI.
When the First World War broke out, Shaw authored the contentious tract Common Sense about the war,
where he argued controversially that all warring nations were equally culpable.
which must have been immediately toxic in the fervent, patriotic atmosphere of the time.
It was career damaging. Biographers note his appearance at any public event caused the instant departure of many of those present. He was ostracized.
He was being logical when the public demanded pure emotion. It was the lowest point of his popularity.
So how did he recover his standing?
Well, his propaganda skills were eventually recognized as too valuable to ignore. In 1917, Field Marshal Haig invited him to visit the Western Front.
And his resulting 10,000-word report was well received.
It focused with his characteristic clarity on the human element of the soldier's life. It began the slow process of rehabilitating his public image.
Shifting to Ireland, he was an advocate for home rule, but remained deeply skeptical of violent action.
He was a gradualist at heart. The Easter Rising in 1916 surprised him, and he expressed horror at the summary execution of the rebel leaders. A colossal political blunder, he argued.
He was dismayed by the 1921 partition, but he maintained an admiration for effective, strong leadership.
Which brings us to his meeting with Michael Collins.
Yes, in 1922, shortly before Collins's death, Shaw met him and was immensely impressed by his effectiveness.
He wrote to Collins's sister, saying he rejoiced in Collins's memory, refusing to snivel over his valiant death.
That admiration for strong, decisive action is the emotional bridge to the truly controversial period of his life, isn't it?
It is. This is the core of the moral challenge for any admirer of Shaw. In the late 1920s and 30s, his disillusionment with the slow pace of Fabian democracy led him to an unnerving admiration for authoritarian leaders.
But wait, isn't that a massive contradiction? How does the man who dedicated his life to gradualism suddenly embrace Mussolini and Stalin?
That's the key question. The sources suggest his admiration stems from a philosophical failure of the pragmatic idealist. He saw that democracy, in the interwar period, was bogged down in inefficiency. He became desperate for leaders who could simply get things done.
So he welcomed Mussolini's accession in 1922, calling him the right kind of tyrant.
In the face of what he called indiscipline and muddle. This flirtation with authoritarian regimes was rooted in his belief that the ends, a stable, socialist-leaning society, justified the means.
Even if the means were dictatorial, and the most egregious example was his support for the Soviet Union.
He visited the USSR in 1931 and met Stalin, his assessment.
Alarmingly uncritical, he described Stalin benignly as a Georgian gentleman with no malice in him.
He uncritically championed the Soviet regime throughout the 1930s, even supporting the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
And this political blindness extended to Hitler, too.
Though his principal admiration was for Stalin, he did praise Hitler as a very remarkable man, a very able man, primarily for his ability to mobilize public will.
He was drawn to power and efficacy above all else, tragically failing to recognize the moral catastrophe these men represented.
And this intellectual failure is impossible to separate from his major political treatise of the era and his deeply unsettling social ideas, particularly eugenics.
His manifesto during this time was The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism and Capitalism.
Yes, his magnum opus political treatise. Hailed at the time, but later critics found it rambling and outdated.
And central to this thought, linking back to man and Superman, was creative evolution, which had now metastasized into his version of eugenics.
That's a painful truth. Shaw's version of eugenics was the belief in, essentially, purposeful human breeding. He argued that if we can breed animals for specific traits, we should apply the same rational principles to humans to improve the species.
And this thinking led to the most controversial statements of his entire career.
Give us the most critical, chilling statements.
By 1933, in the preface to his play On the Rocks, he made the notorious declaration that if we desire a certain type of civilization and culture, we must exterminate the sort of people who do not fit into it.
And 5 years later, in Liberty magazine, he stated even more explicitly, there are many people in the world who ought to be liquidated.
How do we reconcile that specific, chilling language, exterminate, liquidated, with the witty, humane reputation he cultivated for decades?
That is the ultimate interpretive dilemma, and critical opinion is sharply divided. Some scholars argue these comments must be understood in the context of his theatrical persona as the outrageous buffoon.
The idea that he was trolling the public for a good cause, a purposeful prank.
Exactly, using hyperbolic language to shock the conventional audience into taking social reform seriously.
But there is a powerful opposing view.
That this wasn't irony, but evidence that the Shavian outlook had become passé and contemptible. They see his extreme language as a genuine reflection of his philosophical impatience.
The radical idealist who believed so deeply in the goal of creative evolution that he became blinded to the monstrous implications of his own methods.
And crucially, that language was published and promoted at the exact moment actual fascist regimes were putting extermination into horrifying practice.
That parallel is unavoidable. Regardless of Shaw's personal intent, the sources confirm these incredibly inflammatory quotes were a consistent feature of his public commentary in the 1930s.
Casting a dark shadow over his otherwise progressive career. It's the point where his desire for efficiency and reform fundamentally compromised his humanitarian ideals.
It's remarkable to think this man was already past 70 during that turbulent, controversial period. The sheer tireless energy, how did he navigate his final decades?
The 1930s were marked by extensive travel. He discovered that ocean liners offered him a unique source of peace and quiet, allowing him to write plays like The Millionaires while at sea.
In 1933, he finally visited the United States.
Lecturing to a massive audience in the Metropolitan Opera House. He'd previously been deeply critical of the U.S., calling it that awful country, and he remained characteristically unimpressed by Hollywood.
He seemed determined to offend the majority of his audience throughout his life. Did that continue in his later works?
Absolutely. His only subsequent major piece of fiction, The Adventures of the Black Girl in Her Search for God, caused immediate offense to some Christian groups and was outright banned in Ireland. The drive to question and provoke never left him.
What about the Second World War? He was in his 80s when it started.
The war actually saw a massive revival of his earlier classic plays in the West End, featuring huge stars like Laurence Olivier. The Shaws lived full-time at Shaw's Corner throughout the Blitz. He continued writing journalism prolifically.
His final years were marked by loss and continued refusal of establishment honors.
Tragically, his wife, Charlotte, died in 1943. He continued to write into his 90s, though his final works were often criticized as rambling. In 1946, he declined the Order of Merit.
Believing an author's true merit is determined only by the posthumous verdict of history.
He lived until 1950, dying at the remarkable age of 94. What led to his death?
He died of renal failure, precipitated by serious injuries from a fall while pruning a tree at Shaw's Corner.
A fittingly active end for such an energetic man. His ashes, mixed with Charlotte's, were scattered there.
The sources spend significant time detailing his final, incredibly specific and utterly quixotic gesture. The will.
It's the ultimate Shavian prank on posterity. He was a lifelong spelling reformer, and his will stipulated that most of his remaining assets were to form a trust dedicated to the fundamental reform of the English alphabet.
He wanted to replace the 26 letters with a new phonetic version of 40 letters, the Shavian alphabet.
Precisely. He believed current spelling was illogical and hindered learning. However, his drafting of the will was flawed, and the courts initially ruled the trust void.
A reformer even after death fighting the system.
Indeed. The final resolution was an out-of-court agreement that secured a lesser sum, £8,300 for the cause. The bulk of his massive fortune ultimately went to the British Museum, Pradier, and the National Gallery of Ireland.
So what remains of this monumental figure today? What is the Shavian legacy?
The sources consistently rate him as second only to Shakespeare among British dramatists. Scholars credit him with pioneering intelligent theater, the theater of ideas.
He fundamentally changed what an audience expected when they entered a theater. He forced them to think.
And his influence permeated subsequent generations of writers, Noel Coward, Eugene O'Neill.
O'Neill said Shaw opened doors, turned on lights, and expanded horizons.
And more recently, Tom Stoppard is often called the most Shavian of contemporary playwrights. The term Shavian itself has entered the language.
But the greatest irony of his legacy is probably tied back to his biggest commercial play, Pygmalion.
This is the perfect poetic injustice that encapsulates his whole career. Despite Shaw's expressed dislike for musical comedy, which he saw as sentimental fluff,
the adaptation of Pygmalion into the musical My Fair Lady became a global smash hit.
And it generated several £1 million for the Shaw estate. More money, in fact, than all his plays and publications put together during his lifetime.
The man who disdained sentiment, rejected the happy ending, and fought for intellectual purity ended up funding his entire literary estate through the success of a genre he hated.
Complete with a romantic happy ending he explicitly wrote against. It's the ultimate failure of the author to control the cultural reception of his work.
That final assessment from the Times Literary Supplement obituary summarizes him perfectly, doesn't it? that he was no originator of ideas, but an insatiable adopter and adapter.
It is the final, sharpest nugget of knowledge. He wasn't inventing entirely new philosophies. Instead, he took the radical thoughts of his forerunners, Nietzsche, Marx, Dickens, Wagner, and acted as an incomparable intellectual prestidigitator.
He amplified, clarified, and carried those ideas with his inextinguishable wit, so far beyond their original sources that they came to the masses with the vitality of the newly created.
He was a unique force, blending entertainment with relentless social engineering. #outro. So, to synthesize the monumental figure of Bernard Shaw, you have to see him as the self-taught Dubliner who transformed himself into this political and cultural force.
By blending serious economics with unforgettable prose.
He was defined by his commitment to socialism, starting with Fabian Society #2, and his deep yet dangerously pragmatic relationship with power.
He morphed from advocating gradualism to expressing that alarming admiration for dictators like Stalin.
Men who possess the immediate force to enact sweeping change.
And that ultimately is what he was always aiming for, change. The necessity of human improvement through proactive effort. He wasn't interested in making you comfortable.
He was forcing you to confront uncomfortable social truths, whether it was the root of poverty in widowers' houses or the morality of war in Major Barbara.
His wit was his weapon, used ruthlessly to challenge assumptions and to make the argument so entertaining you couldn't look away.
He absolutely believed in the constant necessity of upending established norms for the sake of progress, even if it meant adopting radical and unsettling methods.
So as we close this deep dive, let's leave you with this provocative thought based on Shaw's own restless desire for radical reform.
Shaw once wrote that after 6 years of service, the borough council should be abolished.
Right. So given his lifelong quest for societal restructuring and his later flirtation with authoritarianism that favored bold, immediate action, consider this.
If Bernard Shaw were alive today, what modern institution, seemingly immutable, be it a major social media giant, the structure of global finance, or the established political media ecosystem, what would he argue must be liquidated for the sake of creative evolution?
And why would we find his proposal simultaneously hilarious because of his signature wit and deeply unsettling because of its sheer radical purpose?
Something to mull over until our next deep dive.